Hello and welcome to NewsClick. I'm Prabir Purkayastha with another edition of Mapping Faultlines. Let us go straight to what is roiling the international markets. This is the fact that US stock market has dipped significantly in the last couple of weeks. You can see here that after Trump's victory, which was here, this is Trump's victory, you can see there was a little bit of a bump in the US stock market, which is what happens when most presidents win. Biden had a bump, which is quite significant. It's about 25% in about 150, 160 days. Obama had a bump. Even Trump's first term had a bump. Not very large, but there was a bump. But this time, and this is really the red line that you see here, in the last few days, last month and a half, you can see that the kind of steps that Trump has taken, particularly on the trade front, seems to have cooled the market significantly, and there has been a drop of something like 20 points. That is a significant amount of drop, and this means that the American stock market has lost a significant amount of money. Now this, of course, as you know, for a country which watches the stock market more than the wage rise, the wage bill, and so on, this is very significant for their economy. That means that money can flow out of the American markets into other markets as countries or those who control the finances look for increasing their investments, and they don't want to invest in a stock market, for instance, where there's such a sharp drop that is taking place. We'll discuss these issues apart from the stock market, which of course always interests people because different countries then react differently. Their stock markets sometimes follow what's happening in the US, sometimes are reverse of what's happening in the US as money flows into other stock markets. So that is something that we're going to observe in the future. Let's leave it for the time being. Let's go into the larger political scenario in which, of course, the Ukraine war is the most important. We can see that while you have the United States, which has been talking to Russia for a ceasefire, there have been other countries, particularly at the moment the European countries, United Kingdom, France, who seem to be gung-ho about continuing the war and supporting Ukraine. They have also now started to call themselves a coalition of the willing. As you know, the last time this word was used was during the Iraq war, where coalition of the willing is what the United States has named itself and its allies who are willing to invade Iraq. Now, it's interesting that France, for example, which did not participate in that coalition of the willing, has now started calling itself as a part of this support Ukraine group as the coalition of the willing. So history sometimes has strange twists. We already have gone through earlier Zelensky and Trump's spat in the White House, which Mr. Trump called as a good television. Now, the good television led to the United States stopping military support for Ukraine. I think that has made clear to Ukraine they cannot continue the war without US support. So Ukraine has made concessions saying, yes, they are willing to abide by what Trump is proposing to do with Russia and participate in some kind of peace negotiations. The ball, therefore, was in Putin's court. And a lot of the Western commentators said Putin is going to show his true colors, he's not going to discuss, and the war is going to continue, and therefore we'll have what we call what was already there before Trump took power, status quo ante. It will go back to what it was before Trump won the elections. But Putin has, at least that we can see, has played an intelligent game. He has said he's willing to discuss. Of course, the trumps of the ceasefire will need to be negotiated, and those negotiations are going to be done in the future. We all know that these negotiations are going on in different rooms, in different ways, but these are the backroom discussions in which most of the terms have to be agreed before a formal meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump takes place. What will be Zelensky's role in that? What will be the European Union's role in that still needs to be seen. And I think we'll have to wait till those issues are at least negotiated, which might still hold up the ceasefire. Of course, the ceasefire is not the main issue. What Russia wants is the ceasefire should be such there are prospects of peace and a negotiated settlement. From Russia's side, things are relatively clear that they would like to hold where the current lines are. They will negotiate on those, what would be called in India, the states, but which are really provinces of Ukraine, in which Russia has already held referendum and said these belong now to Russia. Those oblasts or provinces, they will have to negotiate what will be the borders, the current borders or not. But one interesting development has been in the Kursk area. This is what would be called the current scenario in the Kursk area, in which a significant loss of territory has taken place in the last couple of weeks for Ukraine. Russia seems to have reoccupied most of this area, and now only a small strip remains with Ukrainian forces who had invaded in this part. And the major population center, which is relatively an urbanized area, that has been currently captured. The interesting part is not that this front has shifted significantly. That has a bearing on obviously the negotiations, because the argument that was being given why Ukraine had invested so much resources in this salient they had made in Russian territory was this would be a bargaining plank for them regarding other areas that Russia has captured from Ukraine. The interesting part is not that Russia captured territory from occupied Kursk region, which Ukrainians had already taken over, partly taken over, but the way they captured it. This is a pipeline that runs through this territory. And what the Russian forces seems to have done is this is the pipeline which goes to this territory, and they seem to have sent their forces through the pipeline. It's a significant distance, something like 100 kilometers, and they must have taken, even if they used small electrified trolleys, they must have taken some time to get to where they wanted to go through this pipeline. The pipeline is only 4.5 feet high. So this would have meant either electrified trolleys on which the soldiers were sitting or crawling. I will not get into the details. It must have taken them at least a month, 15 to 30 days, we don't know how much time, to infiltrate in this way. The reason they could do so was because Ukraine had stopped the supply of gas, and this gas pipeline therefore was empty. And therefore it made it possible for the Ukrainian forces to be taken by surprise. And this is one of the reasons a large part of the area that we talked about earlier was retaken by Russian forces. So this is an interesting development, not because it's a major war development, but because Ukraine stopping Russian gas flows, which was actually going to not only Ukraine, but also Ukraine's allies, was something which did not help them. Particularly in this case, it seems to have rebounded on them. Let's go back to the Ukraine peace negotiations. Now, again, without trying to preempt what is going to be discussed, simple issue is that who will retain what part of the territory which has come under Russian troops. For Russia, it's liberation of Russian-speaking population who have been fighting a civil war for their identity and linguistic rights. For Ukraine, well, their hope of getting back this territory has receded. More or less, this was what Trump had told Zelensky in the famous blowout that took place in the White House, that you don't have the cards. And therefore, you have to negotiate holding very few cards. And even if the United States helps them, the problem that the US and other NATO allies have, they cannot match the kind of armory that Russia has put in the war, the number of soldiers that's put in the war, particularly on the questions of mortars and shells. And it's clear that the entire NATO productive capacity is beyond what Russia is able to produce. They produced 1 to 2 million shells a year. The combined capacity of the US and other NATO allies at the most 400,000 shells. The Ukraine does produce certain number of shells. A lot of them are proving to be poor quality, and their own soldiers are finding it difficult to use them. So given this, it does seem that freezing the current line of control is perhaps the best course for both sides. Some alignment, some changes, yes, but more or less this is where the negotiations will start from. Ukraine wants guarantees of a kind which will have US forces, EU forces, NATO forces on the ground. That is not going to be acceptable to Russia, because Russia's basic argument is Ukraine cannot become part of NATO, and there's a backdoor entry of NATO again into Ukraine. So therefore, NATO forces cannot be peacekeeping forces. Are there possibilities of other international forces to be peacekeeping forces? That's something we'll have to see. I think that's what the negotiations are going to be about. And also the 300 billion of money, Russian money, which the US and the EU has frozen in their banks. I think that's also going to be a matter of negotiation. So we'll leave it at that, because as we said, none of us have crystal balls, and it's going to be negotiated largely between the US and Russia, with others being bit players. Of course, Ukraine has to agree to this. The issue that Ukraine has, it has very few cards, and without US support, whatever other NATO allies may say, there is no possibility of being able to stop Russia. So I think we leave it at that. Interesting times as the negotiations takes place. What will be the preparatory basis of the negotiations, we still have to see. And this is, again, a time in which a lot of things can happen either way. So I think we should not start thinking peace is on the cards. Yes, chances of peace that we can see, glimmer of peace, the major war that is taking place in Europe going away. But at the same time, we'll have to wait and watch to see what the real outcomes are. Moving on, let's go to the other hot spot which has developed now. That is, again, what has been there, the Red Sea corridor, which had quietened down because Yemen had stopped attacking shipping in this area, and the ships going particularly to Israel. And because it stopped the attacking of the ships, therefore, this Red Sea corridor had quietened down. Now, with resumption of hostilities again in Palestine, as the hostage release, the 42 days was the first phase, that has happened. 42 days are over. Israel seems to have started again hostilities against the Gaza population, or refusing to withdraw, not allowing food. We'll see that later. But because of that, Yemen has started its bombardment of ships again, saying we have declared an embargo again on Israel. As long as they continue their war with Palestine, this will continue from our side. Consequence has been the bombing that the US has done. And this, you can see the bombing where bombs are being dropped. And this area has been bombed by the United States as a response to what they have said is Yemeni attacks Yemeni attacks on shipping. So let's have a look at what the implications for these are. If this route gets blocked, then the ships have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, circumnavigate essentially the whole of Africa to reach the Atlantic Ocean, particularly Europe, and of course it will also continue to the United States. This is a big detour, and it of course increases the cost of everything that travels this route. And this also would happen in reverse. When things come from Europe and the United States to Asia and to Africa, particularly east coast of Africa, then this detour has to take place on both sides. So if we take that, this is a huge increase in cost to shipping to and fro the Atlantic seaboard to Asia. And therefore, this is something the US would like to stop, and therefore the bombardment that we talked about earlier. Let's have a look at Yemen. The real issue, of course, is this area which is controlled by Houthis. The Houthis are the one who today militarily is the most powerful in Yemen, though there are other forces, for instance in Aden and other places, which are not with the Houthis, but nevertheless Houthis remain as a dominant military force in Yemen, and no amount of bombing attacks by United States and its allies has been able to make any difference to the dominance it holds over parts of Yemen, but particularly over the Red Sea traffic. As you can see, there is Saudi Arabia to the north of that. There was a war between Saudi Arabia and Houthis for quite some time. Only recently they have reached an agreement, and there is currently a ceasefire on that count. Given this remains a divided country. We have even Al-Qaeda-like forces in this region. There is also other forces, which is called by Al Jazeera as forces aligned with internationally recognized government. It doesn't mean anything. Only it means that Qatari forces, United Arab Emirates, support another section in this war. But at the moment, that does not control most of the populated areas. The root cause, Israel and Hamas. After the first phase of the truce, the temporary ceasefire, there was supposed to be a second phase of the truce ceasefire. In the second phase, serious questions were to be discussed about the fate of the Gaza Strip. Who will control Gaza Strip? What will be the forces that will be controlling the entry and exit into Gaza? What are the food supplies, the supplies of basic fuel, supply of medicine, how to restore the construction, the buildings that were there, how to restore the hospitals, schools. All this were to be discussed in the second phase. Prerequisite in the first phase was vacation of the Gaza Strip by Israel. Israel refuses to leave parts of Gaza still, what's called the Netzarim corridor, and it still is not willing to let its forces withdraw completely from Gaza. And so instead of the second phase starting, we see a continuation of a kind of scenario where Israel started again its war. Not on the scale it did earlier, but nevertheless the war continues and people are being killed. At least 9 journalists have been killed according to the reports. But the daily reports seem to indicate it's much more than that. Most importantly, food has been stopped. Medicines have been stopped again. So in such conditions, what happens to the ceasefire, and will we see the second phase at all or not? Trump has indicated he wants to negotiate only how this part of Gaza, the part where the Palestinians still are there, they should be vacated they should be removed from there. According to him, they should go to either Africa, Egypt, other Arab countries. But this area of Gaza should be left to the Palestinians, no Palestinians, but to Israel. And what is it that Trump said? A kind of Rivera where people can come, enjoy themselves and so on. A resort for, in other words, West European population people to come on holidays. Now, obviously, those who have fought such a long war are not going to agree to that. So we seem to be looking back at the pre-ceasefire scenario, and are we going to see a restart of the war that has been fought? This is the question. There is a resistance in different parts of the world. It's a fact today that Israel is no longer seen as a nation which even West Europeans can sympathize with. Increasingly, the question about the United Nations and the International Courts of Justice, International Criminal Court have raised is the kind of genocidal war Israel has launched. And let's not forget, with the support of the US and support of other NATO allies in Europe. So this is the issue that we have discussed earlier and will keep on discussing, because I don't see an immediate resolution of the issue. And unless there is a change of government in Israel with Netanyahu and others of his kind, I do not think there is a prospect of long-term peace. And Trump may have, which we had discussed earlier, for the reasons of his, his image, his swearing in, he wanted a peace. That he achieved. But he doesn't really have any long-term stake in peace in Palestine or Gaza. His sympathies are completely with Israel. I think that is also become self-evident now. Let's end on a happy note. As we know that the International Space Station had faced a major problem when the astronauts who have traveled to the space station got stranded there because the Boeing Starliner could not bring them back. There were problems with it. We'll not get into that today. We have covered it earlier. But given that, they were stranded here for about more than 8 months, actually. So now, the SpaceX shuttle has gone to linked with the International Space Station again, getting also some replacement crews. And now, the 2 astronauts who had got stranded there, and that includes Sunita Williams of Indian origin, but very much a part of NASA. So, good news that after 8 months, more than 8 months in the space station, which was supposed to be only about 7-8 days, that they are coming back, and we will see how the International Space Station itself fares, because this was one of the few things which the US and then Soviet Union and Russia later had collaborated, thinking that it is common to humanity to have a space station and this should serve the entire world. This collaboration right now seems to be on rather rocky waters, and we'll have to see whether it continues or we'll have a separation of the international space missions, and one will be completely US and its allies, and the other will be not Soviet Union, but Russia, and maybe it's other countries who would like to collaborate with it. We're going to end this program today. This is all the time we have for Mapping Faultlines today. I'll be with you to discuss various issues that are currently roiling the international scenario and seeing how we should look for our future, and that of course includes India as well.